Third, and that's a problem. I mean, how on earth do you bring these things together? Third, as a consequence of the capitalist restructuring since the 1970s, the traditional terms, I said the traditional terms, okay, the previously available terms of the left's class analysis no longer work. As a consequence of the capitalist restructuring of since the 1970s, the classical terms, the traditional terms of the left's class analysis no longer work. And the relevant areas of change are very easy to list. Differently organized labor markets, new categories and grades of work, new systems of wages and benefits, new forms of the labor process, new types of stratification inside the working class, new transnational circuits of labor migration, new residential patterns of everyday life, fundamentally changed methods of policing and regulation practiced by the state, employers, and unions when compared with the period before the 1970s. Now, actually, each of those terms is classically Marxist. Okay, so it's not that the terms of analysis or the methods are no longer applicable, but the old categories through which we've understood the working class or class analysis more generally no longer work in the same way. Now, the working class is certainly not being abolished. In fact, class as a form of the wage relationship is as extensive, if not more extensive, as it ever has been. And this becomes even clearer once we add the evolving new forms of social insecurity now that the welfare states are being so radically dismantled. But the recomposition of the working class is producing big new political challenges which have not yet coalesced into new and efficacious political forms. The working class of now is not the working class of the 1970s, let alone the working class of the 1940s or the 1920s. The relationship of workers to the work they do has become profoundly different. The available focus of collective organization in and out of the workplace are not the same, nor are the possible forms of collective action. The political languages of class, therefore, also need to change. That's the third point. Fourthly, so how do we understand the new forms of working class formation of the present? And what are the political languages that will not only make sense of those new forms of working class formation, but that can provide access to their political organization or their articulation into a politics that has some popular resonance. Fourth, socialism's place in the larger constellation of democratic politics, so socialism's place in the overall configuration of the left, socialism's place in the overall configuration of the left has become much weaker and more contested than before. And obviously the terms of this discussion are European, right, rather than North American. Socialist languages of politics have been catastrophically delegitimized since the 1980s. Socialist languages of politics have been catastrophically delegitimized in Europe since the 1980s. Again, this fundamentally separates the current period from the first two-thirds of the 20th century, when socialists had successfully claimed the high ground of democratic advocacy. In any of the significant new mobilizations of the 1980s and the 1990s, socialists became just one contingent among many others. And and I think this has been characteristically true of the anti-globalization movement since the late 90s, since, let's say, since Seattle. Avowedly socialist advocacy in Europe, so in contexts where this didn't used to be true, avowedly socialist advocacy has been forced to the margins of the polity. And that has big implications for how we think about the possible sources of support for democratic politics. It changes the relative positioning of socialists within the left when you consider the left as a larger political formation of democracy, as I've been arguing this evening. So, and I have a fifth point that I'll come to in a moment. But what I'm really trying to argue is that there's no going back. Okay, even though the history of the left, you know, particularly in its socialist and communist versions, is an enormously important resource, you know, for thinking about politics and about the possible forms of democratic action. Even though it remains, you know, a vitally important resource, there's no going back to the politics of the first two-thirds of the 20th century. They're not recuperable in that sense. Okay, that's you know, the first part of the argument. The second part of the argument is, let's look at the new social histories of capitalist restructuring in the present and think hard and carefully about the new spaces of politics that are being created. Okay? So the last point is actually a two-part point. Because the first point is about, if you like, is about utopianism, about the ideals. Because one of the things that I've not mentioned in this talk, and then in my sort of 4 points so far, is the idealism and the politics of hope, and the ability to imagine a political future of the good society that was fundamentally important to the ability of masses of people to go on reproducing their identification with those old political forms. Okay. So a really important question about the present is, what's the politics of the future for now, right? How do we think about utopia in this contemporary world environment? Okay, and that's a tough one, it seems to me, because particularly in the light of, you know, my final point, which is about ecology. Okay, and there. Green politics, if you like. There the story is a mixed one, because on the one hand, sort of the politics of the environment and ecology and green politics between the 1970s and the 1990s was a place where a politics of hope, or or an active utopia, a willingness to imagine a society that's better than the one we've got in terms other than consumption, right? The one place where that kind of active utopia was being produced was actually in green politics, has been in green politics. So one context in which elements of the utopian have been reclaimed at a time when, you know, socialist parties and communist parties were basically conceiving of the future in you know, in terms of modernization and technocracy. Okay. One context in which elements of the utopian have been reclaimed was green or radical environmentalist politics. Now, since the 1980s, the literatures staking out this territory are now extremely plentiful. Given impetus first by new social movements in late capitalist societies in the 1980s, then by the movements of indigenous peoples during the 1990s, and most recently by the worsening planetary crisis of climate change or global warming. And there I'm quoting a phrase from an extraordinary article by Dipesh Chakrabarty called The Climate of History, 4 theses, in which he tries to reconceive world history in the light of the contemporary ecological catastrophe. So the planetary crisis of climate change or global warming. Taking our cue from Andean indigenous movements who are proposing to move from anthropocentric struggles towards biocentrism as an expression of a planetary universality, I mean, that's pretty utopian, right? That crisis requires rethinking where left politics may now need to begin. Axiomatically, for classical Marxists, it was a completely given axiomatic truth that socialism could never be built from scarcity. Rather, the very possibility of socialist construction presupposed conditions of relative material abundance bequeathed to society by the full maturity of development of the capitalist mode. Only at the fullest maturation of the development of the forces of production, the production of relative material abundance, was the construction of socialism imaginable, contra Stalin, right? But from our present vantage point, those dialectics of abundance and scarcity, paucity and plenty, and the associated terms of political possibility, it seems to me, are profoundly changed. We live, at the very least, in a world of severely compromised resources, at worst, under the shadow of impending catastrophe. You know, if not during the next 20 years, then certainly during the next 50. Under such circumstances, utopia, so imagining the good society, retracts to a horizon of the merely sustainable. And so learning to survive decently may seem a straitened and prosaic version of the future, but that's where a genuine radicalism of the left, it seems to me, might now have to begin. Okay, that's my last point. And none of this was ever imagined by the socialist tradition in the first 2/3 of the 20th century. Things were only ever going to get better in an endlessly reproduced good present. You know, whether you were a communist or a social democrat. Now it seems to me that kind of myth of modernization is no longer available. I mean, Göran Terborn, very wonderful Swedish social theorist and sociologist, in the aftermath of 1989, I think, published an article which I think he called the end of the future, the end of modernity, as a place where you can imagine visiting, right? No longer there. Okay, we have to think about the present and the future very differently than that. And it seems to me that a good goal is learning to survive decently in those ways. And that's a radical departure. And that's one of the places where a genuine radicalism of the left might now have to begin. That's it.
Okay.